really, when you start by looking at fascism and what it is, fascism is responsible for probably one of the worst, well, probably the worst act in human history, right? It's after the Holocaust, and its sort of shadow still affects life today and stuff. And I want to try and talk about the modern variants and stuff of fascism, right, around here. But the kind of classic picture of Hitler and Mussolini and these kind of people is one part of the equation. On the other hand, it seems to me there's quite a lot. Hi guys. There's quite a lot of confusion about what fascism is in many ways and stuff over it. And you can just think about the last couple of weeks as an example, or the last couple of days even. Donald Trump has just spent many hours retweeting stuff from an organisation called Britain First. People know Britain First is a fascist organisation, right, it's around it. And he's unashamedly done it. First of all, you might have said he's done it as a mistake, but then he's backed himself up and kept on going around the issue, around it. Now, because of Trump's behaviour, lots of people are saying, and actually not just anecdotally, but lots of academics, etc., have started to talk about Trump being a fascist. And it's not particularly surprising when you think about Trump's record and stuff. For example, someone like Steve Bannon, who's linked, centrally a part of what's described as the alt-right, as it were, inside America, was after all his chief of staff in the White House. He's linked to the Breitbart website and the rest of it. After Charlottesville, where there were Nazis marching down the high street at one stage with burning torches, shouting "Jews will not replace us," right, and stuff. Donald Trump's reaction to that was to say, "Hey, there were good people on both sides of the demonstration." And obviously, he's talked about building a wall, the Muslim ban, all that kind of stuff around it. And so, some people argue that Trump is a fascist. Then there's the fact that there are organisations that we in the SWP would argue are fascist that other people don't describe as being fascist. So the Front National in France, organisations like Jobbik or the Golden Dawn in Greece are quite often in the newspapers described as far right or nationalist or extremist in some way. The other thing is that organisations like ISIS or Al Qaeda have been described as fascist and stuff as well. And actually, one of the justifications for the wars in the Middle East has been about the fight over fascism. At various times, Saddam Hussein in the two Gulf Wars was described as a fascist. Britain fought a war against Argentina because the government was described at the time as fascist. So actually, it can be quite confusing, really, to actually find out what you mean by fascism. Some people, in a way, use it as a kind of term of abuse, right, and stuff over it. And we're trying to argue that it's not, that it's something different from that. It's not about terminology, but it's about a strategy that's used at different times and stuff, a specific strategy. And that what fascism aims to do is something very specific. It aims to build a mass movement of people in order to smash working class organisation, to smash democracy, and often it uses racism of different kinds, whether it's anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism against Roma people, etc., etc. It uses it as a way of binding its supporters together, but it's a very specific, kind of movement. And I want to go through that, because if you think, what kind of thing you think you're fighting, then has an effect on the way you fight it. Right, and stuff over it. Trump, for example, right, and stuff over it, I think he's one of the most odious individuals you could possibly think about. He clearly flirts with far-right ideas. He supports Islamophobic and racist ideas. But Trump isn't trying to do that kind of thing. At the minute, Trump is not trying to pull together a mass movement on the street to beat up trade unionists and to break up democracy. He's not trying to outlaw voting and the rest of it. He's a horrible individual. He's a racist, populist politician, but he's not actually a fascist. There are people like Nigel Farage in this country who used to run UKIP, right, stuff over it. It clearly is a horrible piece of work. And again, he flirts with all kinds of individuals, right, and stuff around it. But clearly, is not a fascist. He's not trying to create that kind of street movement, really. It's not, by the way, that there isn't a slippage between different kinds of organisations, right, and stuff over it. Because clearly, if you look at groups like the AfD in Germany, people know the AfD have just had 94 people elected to parliament, right, stuff over it. Horrible Islamophobic, anti-refugee, anti-migrant organisation, stuff over it. Within the AfD, there are people who are nasty racists, there are also people who are old-style fascists. I mean, actually, the woman who's just walked out of being leader of the AfD pointed out she believed that 40 of the 94 MPs were fascists, and therefore there'll be slippage towards different organisations. But what I want to try and argue is fascism is a really specific thing in what it tries to do. Back in the day, the Russian revolutionary leader Leon Trotsky analysed what fascism was, and he talked about a kind of combination of an attempt by these movements to use legal, parliamentary, respectable tactics alongside nasty, violent street gangs, right, and stuff over it, who were used in order to smash up workers' organisations, to smash up different communities. And this came at the beginning from a specific period. It came from the end of the First World War. Right, and at the end of the First World War, you'd had 4 years of horrible bloodletting, the biggest killing in world history. And when the war ended, there were huge uprisings in a whole number of countries across Europe and across the world, right, and stuff around it. In one country, for a brief period of time, in Russia, working class people came to power for a period of time. In other countries, like Germany and Italy and other places, the strikes and movements were so big that people came close to taking power. In some countries, like Hungary, for a period of time, there were workers' councils who ran the country, right, and stuff over it. In this situation, the rulers of different countries really were in utter panic that all their wealth, that all their property was going to be seized from them. And it meant that rather than trying to use the same sort of methods they'd used before the war, or used at other times about democratic institutions, trying to offer concessions to workers and the rest of it, to make sure there wasn't too much unrest and the rest of it. In some countries, the crisis got so deep that they offered their support, at least parts of the ruling class offered their support to fascist movements. So in Italy, for example, there had been massive occupations of factories, big street demonstrations, huge workers' movements for 2 years. The movement didn't break through, and so eventually a fascist movement led by Mussolini, right, and stuff, was born that said they were going to deal with the workers, right, and stuff over it. There were street gangs. They started to beat up trade unionists, beat up socialists, and the rest of it. And eventually they marched to carry out what was called a march on Rome. They took over the government, but they didn't take over the government, as it were, by a mass movement. The king and other elements of the politicians eventually handed them power in order to deal with the left. The same kind of process happened in Germany. Hitler, started out as a sort of beer hall agitator at the end of the First World War. Actually, the Nazis first tried to seize power in 1923. They tried to do it by an uprising in Munich and stuff over it, and he was locked up and sent to prison. And throughout the 1920s, right, and stuff over it, the Nazis were a tiny group, really, in Germany, very marginal. People didn't support them. There was economic stability developed again, and the rest of it. In 1929, you got the Wall Street crash, and when the Wall Street crash started, millions of people are then thrown into a situation where they are absolutely desperate, right, around it, and where even sections of the people at the top of society start flirting with the idea of supporting fascist movements. So the Nazi Party got, I think it was 2% of the vote, or 2.5% of the vote in 1928. 2 years later, they were the second biggest party. In 1932, they were the biggest party, and eventually came to power in 1933. What is fascism, though? What are these movements? They're not something that's created just by the people at the very top of the society to use as a kind of puppet thing when they get desperate. They're genuine movements. Fascism's a genuine movement, but it's a genuine movement normally based on the middle classes. Right. So, what kind of people do I mean? Shopkeepers, petty officials, ex-army officers. By the way, the Nazi Party, the biggest proportionate membership was dentists. So anybody who goes into the dentist has to be very careful, right, about it, right? In other words, what they are is like the middle bit of society. They're not the big business at the top. These people can look after themselves in whatever crisis they do because they make workers work harder, they've got money, they've got friends, they've got influence, they've got power. Workers at the bottom, even when they're poverty stricken, actually have got trade unions, they've got organisations, they've got a way at least of sticking together. The people in the middle in these big economic crises are squeezed both ways. People who put in year after year of their pensions and suddenly find inflation wipes their pensions out. And what Trotsky and other people talked about is these people being driven wild. They're driven wild by the situation. And in that sort of stage, they can be won predominantly as well by using racist ideas to mobilise them into a movement. The people who start to lash out at the left and the workers, the people who are beneath them, and they don't want to fall down into that kind of status. And that's what happened in Germany and happened in Italy. Actually, it's the same kind of processes that you see today in France with organisations like the Front National, in Greece with organisations like the Golden Dawn and the rest of it. Their predominant base is that middle set of people. It's not they don't win working class people's support. They do win working class people's support at different stages, but actually the real base, the fundamental base of where they're coming from, is that middle layer of people in the middle. It's not inevitable that middle class people are always become fascists. So, you know, every time you walk into a shop, you don't have to worry about it. That's the favourite. But in big periods of social crisis, people need a way out. Now, actually, in the early 1920s in Germany, right, stuff, when there was a big social movement that nearly seized power in Germany from the left in 1923, at that time, lots of middle-class people came in behind the left. They came in behind what were the communist parties in that time, which at that time were revolutionary organisations and stuff around that. Actually, in Russia, when its revolution happened in 1917, what was the middle classes in their bulk, people who worked on the land, peasants and the rest of it, backed the regime, backed the government, right, stuff over it. So it's not inevitable that these people will be one to right-wing ideas, but they have to see a way out, and if they can't see the left providing a way out, they can be one to the most horrible way out, which is to smash up the people underneath you in order not to fall down even lower than you are at the moment. And like I said, what fascism is really about, it's not just another reactionary movement. It's not just another bunch of horrible people. What they're about is about fundamentally destroying every level of democracy inside the society, smashing up the working class completely. I mean, for example, in Nazi Germany, they banned the Scouts, right, stuff over it, because the Scouts was an independent organisation, right, stuff over it. You know, churches were banned, everybody was banned that wasn't part of the Nazi setup. And the second thing, like I said about that, is that one of the ways that they attack both, what the Nazis did was attack both big business and the trade unions at the same time, is to try to use what the link they said was it was all about the Jews. The Jewish big business, Jewish trade unions, Jewish socialists, they're all part of this same problem. It doesn't make any sense, but it's a way of binding you up in an ideology to blame somebody. And actually, if you look at groups like I said, the Golden Dawn, the Front National and the rest of it, actually they'll use anti-Semitism and they'll use attacks on the Roman other people. The biggest and most powerful method that's being used by the far right now is Islamophobia. That's absolutely simple. Right, stuff. Exactly the same process that was used in the 1930s against the Jews. Right, stuff, saying that they're to blame for everything, etc., etc., is what's happening to Muslim people now. Right, stuff. Which is why campaigns against the building of new mosques in countries like in Switzerland and other places is such a powerful thing. These people are from outside. They're others. They're the threat, etc., etc., and stuff over. That's why it's being used, and that's why it's really so important at the minute that socialists, just like they did in the 1930s, stood with the Jewish community. It's why it's so absolutely essential that socialists stand with the Muslim community now, because they're being used as the thing to break us up, to try and divide us, because these people are the big problem. How long have I got here? Like 5 minutes, 10 minutes?
10 minutes.
Okay, well, I'll last couple of things to say really. Now, I suppose there's a couple of things to say about this. The combination of a respectable type movement on the one hand and a violent, horrible, racist and you know, kind of a street movement, fascist street movement, right, isn't a new thing. Actually, you know, when we look back at the fascists in the 1930s and stuff, you can think it was just about the demonstrations of the SA and the street demonstrations and the beatings and the rest of it. Actually, Hitler and Mussolini and people also had the other side to them. They tried to put themselves across as completely respectable political figures. They tried to court people who had respect inside society to show that they were, you know, part of the setup. At the same time, they had gangs going out and beating people up. That's the same process, actually. For example, people like Marine Le Pen in France tries to go about. She tries to put herself across as a respectable politician. At the same time, as the Front National have been involved in murders, have been involved in attacking mosques, and the rest of it. Now, if this is a specific movement that is so dangerous, how do you stop it? And this is quite obviously a very, very important question. The first thing is you can't just rely on the lesser evil, right, stuff around it, because actually millions of people can be won to these horrible kinds of movements because they're desperate. Because they look at the way the world works, they look at the effects of an economic crisis, and they think there has to be a way out, and they're looking for a way out. If you just turn around and say, well, in fact, we want more of the same, we want to stick to the way the political setup is now, quite often you can't win the supporters, people away from fascist ideas. You have to offer a radical alternative as well. And that's the same in Germany in the 1920s and 30s, is the same argument that's happening now. You can't just say to people that austerity is okay, but you shouldn't look at these people's ideas. You have to have an alternative to austerity. The second thing is that you desperately need unity against fascism, right, and stuff, and that's for an obvious reason. We need to stick together and the rest of it. But the other thing is, it doesn't matter whether you're a member of the Socialist Workers' Party or a member of the Labour Party or a member of the Green Party or a trade unionist. If fascism wins, you all go the same way. In Germany, right, and stuff, it didn't matter what political party on the left you were or what trade union you were in. You all went to the concentration camp together. And so therefore there is a basis where we have to try and win unity. Unity can be quite difficult sometimes. For example, in Germany in the 1930s, the two biggest left-wing organisations, the Communist Party and the Social Democratic Party, didn't join together to fight the fascists. And you think that's stupid, it's obvious you should do, why didn't you do it? The reason why they hadn't done it is because for a decade beforehand, the Social Democratic Party, which is like the German Labour Party, had been helping to smash up revolutionaries, had helped to break strikes, had run governments that had made cuts and the rest of it, right, and stuff over it. And so people said, what, we can't work together. The problem is when they didn't work together, the Nazis came through the middle. The real point of this, and what Trotsky talked about, was the idea of creating a united front. A united front is not the idea where you drop all your arguments with each other. It's saying in specific things, if Britain First marches, or if you're in France, the Front National is going to march, or whatever and stuff over it, we're going to come together and we're going to stand against them. It doesn't mean we can't argue with each other about what the way is to go forward, but it does mean we have to come together in order to oppose them. Last bits of all, I suppose, is to say, is that it's always important to know your enemy if you're trying to take people on. Now, the problem of racism in society is general. We know that. Stand Up to Racism, for example, as an organisation, as in the last few months, has dealt with institutional racism inside colleges and schools, has dealt with prevent and Islamophobia, has dealt with deaths in police custody. These are all elements of racism and stuff around, and racism's endemic in the society around us and stuff over it. But fascism is something specific. Fascism is a specific kind of movement that's trying to carry out a strategy. And actually, we saw some of this in Poland. People saw the stuff on the news a couple of weeks ago. In Poland, 60,000 Nazis marching through Warsaw and stuff over it and stuff over it. So we have to have specific tactics against them. It means we do believe if Nazis march or try and move, that it is right to try to stop them, to physically stop them, right, and stuff over it. We don't believe they should just simply have the same rights as other political organisations. We do talk about no platforming Nazis. What does that mean? Well, no platforming Nazis and stuff. Actually, there are people with all kinds of right-wing ideas that I would go into a room and argue with or might shout at or whatever and stuff about it, really. But what the Nazis try to do is to try to use democratic structures in order to smash democracy, in order to smash and actually wipe out their enemies and stuff. In that position, if somebody from Britain First wants to speak in a college, I'm for stopping them. I'm for stopping them speaking, whereas other people with different ideas, I'm in favour of debate and discussion and the rest of it. And people might disagree with that, but I think that's something we would argue really hard. In the end, that actually in this country there is a very, very good tradition of driving back the fascists and the Nazis. Britain at the minute is one of the only countries you can think about in Europe without a large-scale fascist movement. Once over it, you go through the rest of Europe and go through the list and stuff. Why is it? I think partly from way back in the 1930s when the Nazis tried to march at Cable Street in East London, right up to recent years in the campaigns against the National Front, the British National Party and the English Defence League, right? What we've had is Unite Against Fascism and other organisations have created real united fronts. Real organisations that have got mass organisations that may have their differences in how they fight on different tactics and stuff, but when it comes down to it, it comes together. The last time the English Defence League tried to march through Tower Hamlets, they didn't. they couldn't get through tower hamlets because of a combination of socialists, trade unionists, the Muslim community, other people who came out and stuff. They physically couldn't get into the borough, and that's one of the reasons why the EDL crumbled as an organisation. One of the reasons previously why the BNP and other organisations have been driven back. So that thing is really important. One is to know what fascism is. Secondly, is to think really how to mobilise it. And the last thing I've ought to say really is this: that if we want to see a world in the end that gets rid of racism and gets rid of the horrors of groups like the fascists try and carry out, it means we have to get rid of these kind of crises that develop. It means we have to get rid of capitalism, right, and stuff, and talk about a system which is a socialist society, which is based on justice for everybody. The alternative we saw in the 1930s and 1940s in Europe, and really we want to make sure we never see that kind of a reality again.